Zimbabwe, welcome back pamzinda wevaneni wenyu super nexus. So ZANU-PF iri panic mode richii chiri kuitika. The man who could replace Mnangagwa is making moves, right? Zimbabwean politics has just entered another explosive chapter, and this time one name is impossible to ignore. Tagwirei, the businessman, ZANU-PF Central Committee member and long-time advisor to President Emmerson Mnangagwa, has just been given a seat in Zimbabwe's Senate. But Tagwirei is not alone. President Mnangagwa has appointed 10 new senators following the constitutional changes that expanded the Senate from 80 to 90 members. And when you look at the list of names, the political significance becomes difficult to ignore, because this is not simply about 10 people receiving parliamentary positions. It is about the new political architecture of Zimbabwe. It is about who is being brought closer to the center of power. And perhaps most importantly, it is about who is being positioned for the future. So the big question Zimbabweans are now asking is ZANU-PF preparing for a major succession battle? And if so, could Tagwirei be one of the men being prepared for the next phase? Let's break it down. So, the 10 new senators on 18 August 2026, President Mnangagwa recommended 10 people for appointment to the Senate, and the Parliament approved the appointments. The 10 are Jabulan Svanda, Mary Mliswa, Nokutula Matsikinyere, Tagwirei, Godwills Masimirembwa, Lucy Chitaga, retired Major General Gibson Mashingaidze, Makosin Hlongwane, Brilliant Dube, and Irene Mutamba. Now, technically, these are Senate appointments created under the constitutional changes, but politics is rarely only about the technical explanation. Names matter, backgrounds matter, relationships matter, and timing matters. And the timing of these appointments is absolutely fascinating, because they come immediately after Zimbabwe's constitutional landscape was dramatically altered. The new constitutional framework expanded the Senate by 10 members and gave the president the power to appoint those additional senators after consultation with Parliament. And one of those 10 people is perhaps the most politically interesting businessman in Zimbabwe right now. Tagwirei. Tagwirei. For years, Tagwirei has been one of the most influential businessmen associated with Mnangagwa administration. He has also been a presidential advisor and a ZANU-PF Central Committee member. Now he is a senator. That means his political profile has taken another major step forward. And this is where the succession conversation gets interesting, because Tagwirei is not a traditional politician who suddenly appeared yesterday. His influence has been growing for years. He has relationships inside government. He has relationships inside ZANU-PF. He has enormous business interests. And he has increasingly become associated with the political machinery surrounding Mnangagwa. So when people like that moves from the world of business and political influence into Parliament, people are naturally going to ask, what's next? Is this simply a parliamentary appointment, or is it another step in a much larger political journey? Nobody can say with certainty, but the question is now legitimate. The man who could replace Mnangagwa, is it the man who could replace Mnangagwa? Now, let's get to the headline. The man who could replace Mnangagwa. Is Tagwirei really being groomed to become president? There is no official announcement saying that. There is no public succession plan confirming it. And Tagwirei himself has not publicly announced a presidential campaign. So let's make that absolutely clear. But there have been reports and allegations suggesting that Tagwirei has ambitions beyond business. One particularly explosive report published earlier this year discussed alleged leaked audio in which Tagwirei was portrayed as a potential kingmaker and someone preparing for a future political role. Zimbabwe. Those claims are disputed and should not be treated as established fact. But they have nevertheless added fuel to an already intense succession debate. And now, Tagwirei is a senator. That changes the optics because politics is about more than what politicians officially announce. Sometimes it is about watching the pattern, businessman, political advisor, ZANU-PF Central Committee member, now senator, and increasingly visible in national politics. At what point does the public start asking, where is this going? Right? Why the Senate matters? Some people might say, bro, he's just a senator. But look at what has happened to Zimbabwe's political system. The Senate has just been expanded. The constitutional changes have also changed the presidential election system, meaning future presidents will be elected by parliament rather than directly by voters. That makes parliament even more politically significant. So the move into the Senate is happening at precisely the moment when parliament itself is gaining enormous importance in determining the country's future leadership. That does not mean Tagwirei is automatically being prepared for the presidency, but it does mean that becoming a senator under this new political system is not something we should dismiss as irrelevant, especially when the person being appointed is already one of the most politically connected businessmen in the country. And then there is Mnangagwa. Now, we come to the biggest part of this story. What exactly does President Mnangagwa want? His government says the constitutional changes are about continuity and the implementation of Vision 2030. Supporters argue that Zimbabwe needs stability and sufficient time to complete the government's development program. Critics see something very different. They argue that the constitutional changes have concentrated more power around Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF. The amendment has already moved Mnangagwa's current presidential term toward 2030 and changed the method of selecting future presidents. And now there are people inside ZANU-PF talking about keeping Mnangagwa at the top of the party even beyond 2030. Harare ZANU-PF chairperson God Wills Masimirembwa has publicly spoken about the province pushing for Mnangagwa to remain party leader until 2037. Think about that. The country has just changed the constitutional timetable to 2030. And God Wills is a senator now. And almost immediately, political voices are talking about 2037. That is why Zimbabweans are asking, where does this end? And then there's the king question, Zimbabwe. Now, we have to address one of the wildest rumors circulating around this political environment. Could Mnangagwa eventually try to become something more than president? Could Zimbabwe become a monarchy? Let's separate fact from speculation. There is no established evidence that Mnangagwa has officially announced a plan to make himself king. There is, however, a public proposal from author and philosopher Joshua Maponga arguing that Zimbabwe should abandon its current democratic system and adopt a monarchy, with Mnangagwa as the country's first king. That proposal has generated discussion, but it should not be confused with any official government plan. And this distinction is important because once people hear the words, Mnangagwa wants to become king, they can easily assume the president himself has announced such an ambition. That has not been established, but the fact that people are even discussing monarchy in Zimbabwe tells you something about how heated the country's debate over presidential power has become, from president to party leader. And this is where things get fascinating. Suppose Mnangagwa reaches 2030. Suppose ZANU-PF continues supporting him. Suppose the party decides he should remain its leader beyond 2030. What happens to the succession? That is the elephant in the room, because every year Mnangagwa remains at the center of ZANU-PF politics is another year in which potential successors have to wait. And waiting creates pressure. This is where Vice President Constantino Chiwenga becomes impossible to ignore. Because for years, Chiwenga has been widely viewed as one of the most powerful potential successors to Mnangagwa. He has seniority, he has political history, he has enormous visibility, and he occupies the position of vice president. But now, there is another increasingly powerful figure inside the ruling establishment, Kudakwashe Tagwirei. That creates a fascinating political triangle. Mnangagwa, Chiwenga, Tagwirei, 3 names, 3 different political profiles, and potentially very different visions for the future. Chiwenga's problem. Imagine the situation from Chiwenga's perspective. You are vice president. The president's current term is heading toward 2030. You have spent years being discussed as a possible successor. Then the constitution changes. The political timetable moves. The president's party starts talking about keeping him in leadership beyond 2030. And at the same time, a powerful businessman closely associated with the president moves deeper into formal politics. Would that automatically mean Tagwirei is being prepared to replace Chiwenga? I mean, absolutely not. But politically, it raises questions, because succession is not only about who has the title today, it is about who is building influence for tomorrow. And Tagwirei's political journey is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The Tagwirei factor. There is another reason Tagwirei attracts so much attention. Money. Mari, Chibans, Ndai, Zimbabwe. Into yokutenga. So, Zimbabwean politics has always been heavily influenced by access to resources. Political campaigns require money, party structures require money, mobilization requires money, and powerful business people can therefore become politically influential even without holding elected office. Tagwirei has been one of the most prominent businessmen linked to the ruling establishment. His appointment to parliament now places him inside the formal political system, and that is a major change. A businessman with political influence has become a politician. A politician with enormous business connections can become even more powerful. That is why people are watching. But is ZANU-PF really in panic? The headline says ZANU-PF in panic. But here's the bigger question. Maybe ZANU-PF isn't panicking at all. Maybe the opposite is happening. Maybe the party believes it has successfully created enough political space to manage its succession process over a much longer period. Maybe the appointments are simply part of implementing the new constitution. Maybe Tagwirei's appointment has nothing to do with succession, and maybe the people predicting an imminent political takeover are reading too much into the situation. That is possible, but politics isn't about waiting until everything becomes obvious. Politics is about watching the moves, and right now, the moves are interesting. The 2030 succession puzzle, Zimbabwe. Here is the puzzle Zimbabwe now faces. Mnangagwa has political continuity until 2030. Some ZANU-PF structures are already discussing extending his party leadership beyond that. Chiwenga remains vice president. Tagwirei has now entered the Senate. The president has gained the new constitutional powers. Parliament has become more important under the new presidential selection system. And the ruling party is preparing for a future political environment that looks very different from the one Zimbabwe had only a year ago. That is a lot of moving pieces, and nobody can confidently predict where they lead. Could Tagwirei really become president? Let's be brutally honest. Right now, saying Tagwirei will become president would be speculation. There is no confirmed succession announcement, but saying Tagwirei is becoming increasingly politically significant is supported by what we can actually see. He has gone from being a major businessman and advisor to becoming a ZANU-PF Central Committee member and a now senator. That progression is real, and that is enough to make people ask whether something bigger is being built. Perhaps the Senate is simply the destination. Perhaps it is one step in a longer political journey. We don't know. And that's exactly why the story is so interesting. The question is Mnangagwa. The bigger question is Mnangagwa himself. Ultimately, however, this story isn't really about Tagwirei. It is about Mnangagwa. Because the most important political decision facing ZANU-PF is not simply who replaces Mnangagwa. It is, when does Mnangagwa actually leave the center of power? If he leaves the presidency in 2030 but remains powerful inside ZANU-PF, the succession looks one way. If he eventually supports a particular successor, it looks another way. If the party decides he should remain its leader, the equation changes again. And if the constitution is changed yet again, well, Zimbabwe would enter an entirely different political chapter. That is why the monarchy rumors, the 2037 proposals, and the succession debate are all being discussed together. They are different things, but they all revolve around the same question. How long does Mnangagwa's political era last? And what about the men waiting? Then there is Chiwenga, perhaps the most fascinating character in this entire story. Because if Mnangagwa is building a political structure around continuity and Tagwirei is becoming more politically prominent, what is Chiwenga doing? Publicly, there is no confirmed declaration of war. There is no official announcement that he is challenging Mnangagwa, but his position means that every move involving succession will inevitably be viewed through the Chiwenga question. And what makes the next few years incredibly important? Because succession battles don't necessarily begin with somebody saying, I want the presidency. They can begin with appointments, with alliances, with provincial endorsements, with party positions, with people being brought closer to the center, and sometimes with a businessman becoming a senator. The final question. So what are we looking at? A routine appointment of 10 senators or the beginning of something much bigger? Maybe Tagwirei is simply entering parliament to serve in the Senate. Maybe Mnangagwa is simply using powers granted to him by the new constitution. Maybe the succession rumors are exaggerated. Maybe the 2037 proposals will disappear. Maybe the monarch idea will go nowhere. All of that is possible. But one thing is undeniable. Zimbabwe's political architecture has changed, and the people positioning themselves inside that new architecture matter. Kuda Kwashe Tagwirei is now officially inside parliament. Constantino Chiwenga remains vice president. Emmerson Mnangagwa remains the dominant figure in ZANU-PF. And the country's political future is increasingly being debated around the year 2030 and beyond. So perhaps the real question isn't who will replace Mnangagwa. Perhaps the real question is, who is Mnangagwa preparing to be standing at the door when his era finally ends? Because if Tagwirei's political rise continues, and if the Senate appointment is only one step in a much bigger journey, Zimbabwe could be watching the emergence of a completely new political player. And if that happens, the succession war inside ZANU-PF could become the biggest political story in Zimbabwe. The chess pieces are moving in Zimbabwe, and the next move could change everything. So stay tuned. Thank you for watching. Catch you in the next one. Ndini wenyu Super Nexus. Peace.